The first time my mother saw my face on the screen, everything in the dining room went quiet. The clatter of silverware against china faded. The low hum of country club chatter dropped off, and all I could hear was the soft buzz of her phone in her shaking hand. White linen reflected the midday sun, filtering through the tall windows, casting a pale glow over the table as Carol turned her screen toward her. "Oh my God," she breathed, her pearl bracelet clicking softly against the glass. On the phone, under the bright glossy masthead, was a photo of me in my studio fabric rolls behind me like a painted backdrop. My mother's fingers tightened around the stem of her water glass, ice cubes clinking against crystal as she stared. Her lipstick suddenly looked too bright against how colorless her face had gone. That's you, Diane," whispered the scent of roasted chicken and truffle oil drifting up from forgotten plates. Across the room, someone said, not even trying to whisper, "Is that her? From the new Vogue cover?" My mother's eyes finally lifted from the screen to my face, mascara already starting to smudge at the corners. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice thin and high, trembling in the cool, air-conditioned hush. "Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you." My name is Rachel Morgan, and a few hours before that moment, I was standing in front of the same country club, tugging at the hem of my gray hoodie, while a chilly spring wind slid under the cotton. The flag out front snapped against a pale blue sky, and the smell of freshly cut grass floated over from the golf course, too clean and manicured to feel real. I caught my reflection in the glass doors. Faded vintage jeans, white sneakers, still dusted with thread from the studio hair, pulled back in a low knot, and I could already hear my mother's voice in my head, sharp as the click of her heels on marble. "This is a mistake," I muttered under my breath, my fingers rough with the texture of patterned paper and fabric from the morning's work. But I pulled the brass handle anyway and stepped into the cool, lemon-scented lobby. I spotted her immediately standing by the host stand under a chandelier that threw warm, yellow light over her pale pink blazer and pearls. My mother's perfume, something expensive and floral, hit me before she did. Her eyes swept over me once, from my worn hoodie to my sneakers, and the muscles in her jaw tightened so subtly that anyone else might have missed it. "Rachel," she said, the way someone might comment on a stain. "That's what you're wearing." The air conditioning hummed above us, a soft, constant drone, while the hostess smiled politely like she wished she could vanish into the wallpaper. I felt my shoulders tense, the cotton of my hoodie rough against the back of my neck. "I came straight from the studio," I said. "I've been cutting patterns all morning." Mom exhaled through her nose, a short, annoyed puff. "This is a professional lunch?" she murmured, already turning toward the dining room, the click of her heels sharp on the polished floor. "You look like you got lost on your way to the laundry room." The dining room was a soft blur of champagne glasses, white tablecloths, and low conversation punctuated by the quiet clink of forks. Light poured in through the big windows, bouncing off silverware and crystal, so everything seemed a little too bright. At a round table near the center sat 3 women I'd known by name since I was a teenager. Carol Bennett lifted her head first, her diamond earrings catching the light as she smiled the way people smile at a child who has disappointed them. Diane Lawson adjusted the cuff of her cream blazer, the faint smell of her strong coffee reaching me as we approached. Patricia Chu set down her phone with a tap that sounded louder than it should have on the glass tabletop. "This is my daughter Rachel." My mother announced the words smooth but edged. "She's between opportunities right now." The phrase hung in the air thicker than the scent of butter and garlic drifting from the kitchen. Heat crept up the back of my neck beneath the soft cotton of my collar. "I run my own company," I said, my voice even, but I could hear the slight dryness in it, like my throat had forgotten how to swallow. "A little clothing venture," Mom added lightly. fingers brushing crumbs from the starched tablecloth as she sat. She makes things in her apartment. Carol's lips curved in a pitying smile as she reached for her water ice cubes, tapping softly against the glass. How nice, she said, like she was talking about a church bake sale, a hobby business. The word hobby slid over my skin like sandpaper. Diane leaned in the faint clink of her bracelet, breaking the moment. I'm sure it keeps you busy, she said. But have you given any thought to a real career? My husband's company is always looking for administrative assistants. Stable work, good benefits. The waiter appeared with bread, the warm smell of yeast and garlic rolling over the table, and I watched my mother lift her chin just a little higher as he set the basket down. That's what I keep telling her, Mom said, reaching for a roll she wouldn't eat. Get something stable first. She had such promise. Top of her class at Parsons, all the right internships. We thought she'd be at a major fashion house by now. Instead, her hand made a vague, dismissive little circle in the air, manicured nails catching the light. I felt my fingers curl under the edge of my napkin, the thick linen ruff against my palm. The truth, 6 years of long days, ethical factories, and steady growth pressed against the back of my teeth. The clatter of plates, the muted laughter from the table behind us, the distant hiss of the kitchen doors swinging open and shut all blended into a dull roar in my ears. Finally, I said, we did $4.7 million in revenue last year. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the tinkling of ice in Patricia's glass as she took a sip. Then my mother laughed that high, airy sound I'd heard in living rooms and banquet halls my whole life. Rachel, don't exaggerate, she said, her hand resting lightly on Carol's arm, as if to reassure her. She works out of her apartment. I work out of a 12,000-square-foot studio in Brooklyn, I replied, feeling the wooden chair cool and hard against my spine. I bought the building last year. We have 34 employees. Patricia's brows rose as she tilted her head, the light catching the silver streak at her temple. That's impressive, she said slowly. For a small operation. My mother shook her head, the pearls at her throat shifting with the movement. It's not sustainable, she cut in the scent of her perfume, suddenly cloying in the warm room. She's burning through savings. I keep telling her, apply to a real fashion house, start as an assistant buyer, work your way up. She wants success overnight. The irony of that sentence, after 6 years of 16-hour days, tasted bitter on my tongue, like oversteeped tea. The conversation at the next table swelled and dipped, and somewhere a spoon clinked loudly against porcelain, making me flinch. I'm not burning through savings, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady, fingers smoothing the crease in my napkin, just to have something to do with my hands. The company is profitable. We have wait lists for every collection. My mother's smile tightened the corners of her mouth, pulling just a bit too high. Rachel, she said slowly, as if trying to be patient, this is exactly what worries me. This fantasy. Claiming you own buildings, claiming you're making millions. It's not healthy to lie to yourself like this. The word lie hung in the air as heavily as the chandelier above us. Carol's eyes softened with concern that didn't feel like it was for me. Diane reached over and gave my hand a quick pat, the cool metal of her rings pressing into my skin. We're only trying to help, she said. Surely if you'd really bought a building, you'd have some proof. I could feel my phone in the pocket of my hoodie, a small rectangle of glass and metal against my hip, heavy with photos of the studio mortgage documents, bank statements, staff headshots. The truth was right there, a few swipes away. But as the air conditioning hummed above us and the scent of grilled salmon floated over from a nearby table, I realized something cold and familiar in the pit of my stomach. They didn't actually want proof. My mother's eyes were already narrowed, her fingers drumming lightly on the tablecloth in an impatient rhythm. Go on, she said, a brittle smile on her face. Show us. If it's real. I held her gaze for a long moment, the room around us blurring at the edges, my heartbeat loud in my ears like distant footsteps in an empty hallway. The words came out softer than I expected, but they were steady. Believe what you want. And just as my mother opened her mouth to turn that into one more example of my supposed immaturity, a young voice at my shoulder said quietly, Mrs. Bennett, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I had to say something about your daughter. The cafeteria lights flickered softly above me, humming with that low electrical buzz I always remembered from school hallways. I was 12, kneeling on the cold tile floor, gathering the pieces of a lunch tray someone had knocked out of my hands. The smell of tater tots and overcooked green beans clung to the air, but all I could really smell was the metallic tang of embarrassment as heat crawled up my neck. A few tables away, my mother stood with the principal smiling that bright polished smile she saved for adults who mattered to her. She didn't glance my way, not even when a boy's laughter echoed against the painted cinder block walls sharp as a pebble hitting glass. She's so dramatic, someone whispered behind me. My fingers brushed through spilled applesauce, sticky and cold, while my mother's heels clicked away across the linoleum. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and simply chose to keep walking. Even now, decades later, I can still feel the chill of that floor through the knees of my jeans whenever I think about where all this really began. I didn't understand everything back then, but I understood enough to know that being overlooked in that cafeteria wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern one I learned to adapt to quietly. Growing up with my mother, Linda, meant living in a home where appearance filled the air, like a perfume you couldn't stop breathing in. Even the light in our house felt curated, warm lamps, polished brass, soft rugs that muted your footsteps so no one disturbed the illusion of calm. But under that softness, there was a quiet current, a steady hum of expectation. Whenever she spoke to me, her tone would carry that faint air of evaluation, as if she were constantly adjusting me in her mind like a hemline that wasn't quite straight. I was a quiet child, not out of shyness, but because I'd learned early that silence meant safety. Speaking up invited correction. Asking questions invited comparison. My older cousin, Melissa, was the kind of child my mother adored. Polished, articulate, always dressed in crisp dresses and patent leather shoes. I remember one Easter morning, the house filled with the yeasty smell of warm bread and the sharp sweetness of lilac perfume. I'd come downstairs wearing the dress I'd sewn by hand, pale blue cotton, uneven stitches hidden as best I could. My mother looked up from the dining table where she was arranging silverware in perfect alignment, and her eyes swept over me like a cool draft. You should change, she said, adjusting a fork by a fraction of an inch. It looks homemade. It is homemade, I whispered. The fabric suddenly felt scratchy against my skin. Melissa twirled beside her in a store-bought dress, the skirt swishing lightly with each movement. My mother smiled at her reflection in the window, not at me. Moments like that came often small, quiet, forgettable to everyone but me. And each one carried its own sensory imprint, the faint tang of lemon polish on the dining table, the cold echo of her bracelets clinking as she waved me off the tight pull in my chest as I swallowed whatever I'd wanted to say. By the time I reached high school, I'd learned to fade into the background during family gatherings. Thanksgiving dinners at my aunt's house were always the same warm kitchen light, the smell of turkey and cinnamon, the low rumble of adults talking above my head. My mother would praise my cousin's debate trophies or choir solos, then turn to me with a polite smile that never touched her eyes. Rachel's still trying to figure out her interests, she'd say, spinning it like a neutral observation, while her hand tightened slightly around her wine glass. I wasn't figuring things out. I knew exactly what I loved. I'd sit by the fireplace, sketching dresses in the margins of my school notebooks, the paper warm under my palm, the sound of logs crackling behind me. But I'd stopped trying to show her. Every time I did, she redirected the conversation or offered a suggestion that felt like a correction. Why don't you join a business club? Or, art is nice, but it's not a stable path. Her voice was always calm, always reasonable, but something in the way she said it wrapped around my ribs like a belt pulled too tight. I used to think the problem was my own lack of confidence. It wasn't until I grew older that I realized confidence can't take root in soil that's constantly being leveled under you. When I was accepted to Parsons, I remember her standing in the hallway, the afternoon sunlight falling across her face, turning her gold necklace into a thin line of light. She smiled, but it was the same smile she'd give a neighbor telling her about a garage sale. Well, she said, smoothing her blouse, if that's what you really want. Her voice was warm, but not encouraging, soft, but not supportive. It was a tone reserved for decisions she hoped were temporary. During my years at Parsons, the studio was always filled with the sound of sewing machines, the hum vibrating through the floor into my shoes. The smell of fabric dye steam from pressing irons and the faint scent of graphite from my pencils created a world where I finally felt awake. Yet every time I called home, the disconnect remained. If I told her about a design I was proud of, she'd reply with, "That's nice, dear," then pivot to asking whether I'd considered applying to an established corporate design program. It always felt like she was steering me gently but firmly away from what I loved, as if she feared that my passion was a cliff edge I didn't see. I don't think she ever realized how deeply those small comments landed. She never heard the silence that followed them, the way I'd stare at my sketchbook, with the steady thrum of the city below my window, wondering if maybe she saw something I didn't, wondering if all my classmates were moving forward while I was pretending. Sometimes, the radiator pipes in that old walk-up would crack loudly in the night, and the sound would turn into a kind of accusation in my mind, like something was insisting I pay attention to the doubt she'd planted. But I pushed through. I took an assistant designer job at a big fashion house after graduation, and for a moment I thought the quiet tension might finally ease. The office smelled of new fabric bolts and expensive perfume, the windows casting sharp lines of afternoon light across long cutting tables. My mother approved of that job. I saw it in the way her voice brightened on the phone, the way she told relatives Rachel finally has something solid. I remember standing in that bright, over-air-conditioned office, holding the phone to my ear while she spoke proudly about my new role. And I remember feeling a strange mix of warmth and shame because her approval came only when I followed the path she considered respectable. Not because of the work itself. Not because of me. I didn't stay in that job long. The waste, the excess, the way discarded fabrics piled up like forgotten promises, those things wore on me. I left quietly, and when I told her, the air in our kitchen seemed to shift. The smell of roasted chicken cooling on the counter suddenly felt too heavy. She placed her hand on the counter, fingers tapping lightly. "Are you sure this is wise?" she asked, her voice soft with concern that pressed into me like a thumbprint. You finally had something stable, and I heard it again. Her fear, her doubt, her belief that my choices came from naivete rather than vision. It didn't take long before she categorized my new business as a phase of distraction. Every holiday dinner became a gentle interrogation. "How long do you think you'll keep trying this?" she'd ask, lifting her wine glass to her lips, the stem cold and thin between her fingers. Or, "Have you thought about a real plan?" Always asked with a soft voice, always accompanied by a slight tilt of her head, as though she were consoling someone she didn't quite trust to know better. These moments stacked up like layers of thin paper, too light to notice individually, but heavy with time. They shaped the way I held myself, the way I spoke about my work, the way I braced for dismissal even before a word left my mouth. So when she introduced me at that country club lunch as between opportunities, it wasn't a shock. It felt like the latest entry in a long, quiet ledger of minimization. My chest tightened in a way I recognized from childhood, the same tightness I'd felt on that cafeteria floor. Elbows slick with applesauce while she walked past without looking down. What I didn't know that afternoon, at least not yet, was that one unexpected voice at that table was about to cut through all those years of soft-edged dismissal. A voice that would shift the air the way a window opening changes the temperature of a room. And the truth that followed would leave no silence large enough for the old story to hide in anymore. The first hint of it came in a flicker of screen light across the tablecloth, a glow that cut through the soft clink of silverware and the murmur of country club chatter. Patricia's phone buzzed again, a sharp vibration against the glass, and she angled the screen toward herself. Her brow tightened. The light from the window caught the edge of her glasses as she leaned closer, scrolling slowly, her finger pausing mid-swipe. Across the table, I could hear the faint hiss of the espresso machine from the bar, steam dragging through the air. Then she whispered, almost under her breath, "Oh, my God." She turned the phone slightly, and the glossy image filled the space between us. My face stared back at me from the screen, lit with studio lights, framed by rolls of fabric, the headline blazing in crisp white serif across a charcoal background. The center of the dining room seemed to tilt the room, narrowing into a tunnel of sound and breath. Carol gasped, a tiny sharp sound like a teacup cracking. My mother's hand slipped from her water glass, ice tapping gently against crystal as the glass wobbled. Her breath hitched audibly. The chandelier above us reflected tiny gold flecks across the screen, a constellation shimmering over the photograph of me. Catherine reached for the phone, her ring sliding softly against the table as she pulled it closer. "Is this real?" she asked, voice trembling. A faint warmth from the overhead lights pressed against my skin, too bright, too close. My mother's fingers hovered inches above the tablecloth, stiff, unmoving. "That's you," Diane said, voice thin. "Rachel, that's you on the cover of Vogue." For a moment, I could only hear my own breathing, shallow, uneven, while their eyes all lifted toward me in slow, disbelieving unison. It was the moment everything snapped into place, loud as a branch cracking in a winter forest. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, I felt the familiar weight in my chest, that old ache pressing beneath my ribs. Because I knew even before anyone spoke that what was happening at that table wasn't about Vogue. It was about the truth finally breaking through a story my mother had been telling for years, one I had been too tired, too conditioned, too worn down to challenge. The notifications had begun pouring in the moment the issue was announced online. I hadn't checked my phone during the lunch, I knew better. But now I could see the preview article loading on their screens, each headline unraveling a version of my life that I had lived quietly, steadily, without fanfare. And I could see something else too. My mother's face tightening, her pupils narrowing the way they always did when reality collided with her expectations. Watching her look at that screen felt like watching a mirror crack. The article laid everything out with clinical clarity. My company's valuation, our manufacturing partners, the building I'd purchased with my own money, the sustainable supply chain I'd spent years constructing piece by careful piece. Seeing the truth written in black and white by someone who didn't even know me made something inside me shift, like a door unlocking after years of pressure against the hinges. I hadn't realized until that moment how deeply she'd buried my accomplishments under her version of my life. The evidence had been there all along. Not just in the numbers, not just in the studio I walked into every morning with the smell of steam and fabric dust clinging to the air. Not just in the employees who counted on me. It had been in every conversation she turned away from, every story she cut short, every holiday where she introduced me as in transition while I carried an entire business on my shoulders. But the Vogue cover, her seeing it, her friends seeing it, forced something into the light that she had been determined to keep in shadow. I watched Patricia scroll the tip of her nail tapping the screen as she read through paragraphs I'd memorized during the fact-checking process. My heart pounded with each slow movement of her hand. I knew what was coming next. I knew where the article would land. And then Carol read it aloud, her voice quivering in the soft glow of the chandelier. My mother thought I was failing because I chose purpose over prestige. I built a company while she told people I was between opportunities. Success doesn't always look the way people expect it to. The air in the room changed temperature. The hum of conversation dimmed. Even the clatter of dishes from the kitchen seemed to fall away. My mother went very still. Her hands, always so composed, trembled on her lap. She didn't reach for her water. She didn't look at anyone. She just kept staring at the words on the screen as if they were written in a language she'd never learned. Something inside me, something quiet and tired and long overlooked, finally rose. The truth didn't come to me all at once. It came in pieces, small, sharp fragments that had been floating around for years, finally coming together. I realized that my mother had never believed a single number I'd given her. Not because she doubted my math, but because she had decided long ago who I was allowed to be. She had decided I was someone who would never succeed without following her version of a respectable path. Someone whose accomplishments could only be temporary accidents. Someone who needed to be redirected, corrected, guided back towards stability. Stability defined strictly by her rules. And seeing her stare at that cover, watching her face lose its certainty, I understood something else. She hadn't just underestimated me. She had rewritten my life in her mind, edited out the parts that didn't fit, smoothed over anything that suggested I was building something real, something lasting, something she could not control. For years, I thought she just didn't understand what I was doing. Now I saw the truth she had chosen not to. As her friends read through the article page by page, their voices soft and careful, I felt each word open another drawer inside me. Drawers I had kept closed because looking inside them hurt too much. I remembered the times I told her about our early revenue, and she dismissed it without asking a single question. I remembered showing her a photo of a jacket I was proud of, and her comment about how the model looked underwhelming. I remembered telling her we were hiring 2 new seamstresses, and her reply, "Be careful with debt, sweetheart. You can't afford to make risky choices." Risky choices? That phrase echoed in my head as she stared at the Vogue cover of my face, a face surrounded by the very work she had refused to acknowledge. There, on that glossy screen, was proof of every choice she had labeled irresponsible, and next to it were her friends reading my story like they were uncovering something fragile and bright that had been hidden under a dust-covered sheet. The truth was that I had built my company without her approval, without her curiosity, without a single moment of genuine pride from her. Not because she didn't care, but because she cared more about how my life reflected on her than how it felt for me. The betrayal wasn't dramatic. It wasn't one moment. It was a continuous, quiet erosion of belief. And now, for the first time, I saw it clearly. Resolve does not come like a flood. It comes like a tightening. The tightening of your ribcage when you realize someone you love has been looking at you through the wrong lens for years. The tightening in your throat when someone else's story finally tells your own word for word. The tightening of your hands when you know without doubt, without hesitation, that something needs to be said out loud in the open, where it can't be softened or taken back. Sitting there in that country club, with the scent of roasted herbs in the air and the murmur of disbelief around me, I felt that tightening. It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was clarity, steady and unyielding. The truth had been exposed not because I forced it, but because it could no longer be hidden. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the boundary thin, stretched, straining between who I had been raised to be and who I had become. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I turned toward my mother, her eyes still fixed on the screen, and I felt the words rising, not harsh, not cruel, but unavoidable. The time for silence had ended, and the confrontation that followed would unravel everything she thought she knew about me. My mother's hand was still frozen above the table when the room turned toward me. The lights from the tall windows washed over the white tablecloth, and for a breath, everything was still. Plates half-lifted, forks suspended. Then I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping softly against the polished floor. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "If you want proof," I said quietly, "you should hear this." I lifted my phone, tapped the screen, and the audio began to play clear, sharp, unmistakable. My mother's voice filled the dining room speakers around us louder than I had ever heard it. "Don't bother looking at Rachel's application," she said on the recording. "She isn't ready for real responsibility. She still lives like a child." Conversation stopped. A waiter froze mid-step holding a tray of sparkling water. My mother's face drained of color as her own voice echoed through the country club's air-conditioned hush. "Please," her recorded voice continued, "don't tell her I called. She'd be embarrassed." Someone at another table gasped softly. The sound of clattering silverware from across the room rang out like a dropped pin. I ended the recording. Silence smothered the room. A moment earlier, none of them knew what I carried with me. But this was the moment everything tilted. The road to that recording had begun months earlier when I'd applied for a partnership grant tied to a nonprofit fashion initiative. I was qualified, overqualified, but the response had been strangely cold. "We've decided to move in a different direction," they'd said. Their voices were kind but evasive. And then one of the board members, a woman I'd met at a conference, forwarded me the voicemail my mother had left for them behind my back. It took me days to open the file. When I finally listened, sitting alone in the dim warmth of my studio after midnight, the sound of her voice had hollowed something inside me I hadn't known was still soft. That was when I knew she hadn't just talked about me dismissively at social events. She had actively undermined my opportunities. Quietly. Consistently. That recording wasn't the only thing I'd brought with me to the country club that day. In my bag was the grant rejection letter, the timestamp on my mother's voicemail, and a copy of the email chain showing she had contacted them first before I even applied. I didn't know then whether I'd use it. I only knew that I was tired of being edited out of my own life. But when they all stared at me, Carol with her fingers clutching her pearl necklace, Diane blinking as if her lashes were dusted in frost, Patricia's mouth barely open in disbelief, I realized this was the only moment the truth would cut through. So I pressed play. Now the echo of that recording hung in the air like cold smoke. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came. The scent of roasted herbs from the nearby serving station felt suddenly too strong, like it didn't belong in the same room as what had just happened. "Rachel," she whispered, "where did you get that? I didn't sit down." My palms rested lightly on the tablecloth, the linen cool and crisp under my fingertips. "They sent it to me," I said. "After you told them I wasn't ready. After you told them not to tell me you'd called." A flush crept up her neck. Her fingers twitched as though reaching for a defense that wasn't there. "I was trying to protect you," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want you to get your hopes up for something you might not handle." A murmur slipped through the tables around us, a wave of disbelief, soft but audible. Carol leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Linda, you did that." My mother blinked rapidly, breath shaking. I didn't mean it the way it sounded, but there was more, and the room had not yet heard all of it. I reached into my bag and placed the printed email chain on the table. The paper made a soft, whispering sound as it slid across the linen. "You didn't just call them," I said. "You contacted all 3 board members. Twice. You told them I wasn't reliable, that I didn't follow through, that I used money recklessly." I tapped the page gently. "You said you were my mother and that you knew what was best." Diane's face went pale. Patricia inhaled sharply through her nose, slow and deliberate, like she couldn't believe what she was witnessing. My mother pressed her napkin to her mouth with a trembling hand. I never thought you'd see those." That, I said quietly, is exactly the problem. The confrontation broke open from there, not loud, but devastating in its quietness. For years, I had imagined that if the truth ever came out, I would be the one shouting. But now in this cold, elegant room, with its soft piano music still playing faintly from hidden speakers, my voice was steady. It had weight. "You told everyone I was unemployed," I said. "You told your friends I was directionless. You told relatives I couldn't manage my own finances." Her hands shook so hard, the napkin slipped to the floor. "That wasn't gossip, Mom. That was sabotage." A woman at a nearby table, someone I didn't know, stopped mid-sip of her champagne, her eyes fixed on us. My mother looked around as if searching for an escape route. Her breath came fast, shaky. "I didn't want you to get hurt," she whispered. I leaned forward just slightly, the tablecloth cool against my arm. "And yet you were the one doing the hurting." The chandelier above us flickered faintly as shadows shifted across the room. "But that's not all," I said. A visible ripple went through the tables around us. My mother's shoulders stiffened. I reached into my bag once more. This time, I pulled out a printed copy of a bank email one I had received a year earlier when I tried to refinance the studio building. "You also told the bank," I said softly, "that you believed I was a financial risk. You contacted them, pretending to be a concerned relative." I held the document up. "You told them to look into my spending." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Someone's fork clinked sharply against porcelain, then stilled. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. Her eyes glistened with the kind of fear I had never seen in her. Not anger, not shame, but the shock of being exposed without warning. "You weren't supposed to know any of this," she whispered. "That, I said, is how betrayal works." The twist was complete, and the room leaned toward me, toward the truth, with a quiet, collective exhale. Patricia spoke first, her voice firm despite the softness in it. "Linda, why would you do all that?" My mother shook her head helplessly. "I thought if she failed quietly, it would be safer. I wanted her to have something stable to fall back on." "But she didn't fail," Carol said. You kept her from succeeding in places she had already earned. The words struck harder than anything I could have said myself. My mother's breathing trembled, and for the first time since I was a child, she looked small. Small in a way that came not from shame, but from the weight of truth finally settling on her shoulders. But the moment wasn't over. I straightened. The air around me felt different, lighter, sharper. You spent 6 years telling people I wasn't capable, but the only person who couldn't see what I built was you. My mother's tears spilled over. I didn't know how to stop, she whispered. It became easier to keep the story going than to admit I was wrong. I lifted my chin. That story ends today. The room did not erupt. It quieted, deepened, settled. The balance, the power she'd always held over my reputation, my confidence, my sense of worth shifted like a slow-moving tide. Even she felt it. My mother lowered her hands from her face, staring at the tablecloth, as if seeing it for the first time. Rachel, she said softly, I'm so sorry. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I gathered the papers, slipped my phone back into my bag, and pushed my chair away from the table. The legs scraped gently across the floor, the sound strangely grounding. People stepped aside as I walked. Not out of fear, but respect and understanding that something profound had happened at that table. Something that had been waiting years to surface. My mother reached out a trembling hand, but I stepped past her. Behind me, the dining room sank into a stunned hush, broken only by the faint hum of the chandelier and the soft clinking of water glasses. I didn't need them to follow me. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need her defense. I had said what needed saying. And with every step I took away from that table, I felt the past loosen its grip. When I stepped out of the country club, the heavy door eased shut behind me with a soft thud, sealing off the echoes of voices that had risen and fallen like a storm. The sunlight outside felt different, warmer somehow, brushing against my face like a quiet reassurance. For the first time in years, I didn't feel that familiar tightening in my chest. My breath slipped out slowly, as if my body had been waiting a long time to release it. The parking lot was still, save for a few birds hopping along the curb, their shadows flickering against the asphalt. I took a few steps forward, the breeze lifting the edge of my jacket, and realized something had shifted inside me, firm, irreversible, and oddly gentle. That understanding carried me through the rest of the afternoon, like a low current, guiding me forward. The walk back to the subway steadied my thoughts. Traces of the day still clung to me, the chill of the dining room's air conditioning, the stunned silence after the recording, the look in my mother's eyes when she finally saw the truth. But each step away from that building felt like reclaiming ground I'd spent years surrendering by mistake. In the weeks that followed, I began sorting through the parts of my life that had been shaped by her doubt, not my own belief. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand renovation, no wild declaration of independence. Just small, steady acts that gradually stitched something new into place. I spent long evenings in my Brooklyn apartment, the warm lamplight spilling across my hardwood floors as I opened old boxes and papers I'd kept out of habit. Some held early sketches curled at the edges, still smelling faintly of pencil graphite and muslin. Others were printouts of emails I never answered because her voice echoed louder in my mind than my own. I sorted through each one slowly, like clearing a garden after a long winter. I kept the pieces that reminded me who I had been all along. I let the rest go. One Saturday morning, after a late night at the studio, I stood in the quiet stillness of my apartment and finally saw it for what it was, a place of transition, not of rest. The sunlight angled through the blinds, striping the floor. The radiator popped softly the way it had the day I moved in. It had been enough then. It wasn't anymore. By lunchtime, I was standing outside a brownstone 2 blocks away, keys in hand. A former textile artist had lived there for decades, and when she passed, her family sold the apartment as is. Dust coated the windowsills. The wood floors were worn to a soft sheen in places dulled in others. But when I stepped inside, the faded paint and lingering scent of cedar meant possibility, not decay. I spent the next several days cleaning the place myself, not because I had to. My company could easily have hired someone, but because the quiet hours of scrubbing, repainting, and opening windows felt like claiming something I'd earned. Warm sunlight drifted through the open windows as I wiped down each baseboard. The soft scent of lemons rose from the bucket at my side, and for the first time since childhood, my thoughts were accompanied by silence, not someone else's expectations. There was no anger guiding me, only clarity. I didn't cut ties with my mother all at once. That kind of severing rarely heals anything. It just leaves sharper edges. Instead, I created distance measured not in miles, but in what I allowed to reach me. Her texts came often at first, long messages full of regret, explanations, attempts to rewrite the past. I answered only some, short, calm, and firm. Over time, the messages became quieter, more thoughtful. She started asking real questions about the work, about the studio, about the people I employed. She didn't always know how to ask, but the effort felt different, more cautious, more honest. I didn't rush forgiveness, and I taught myself not to feel guilty about that. At the studio, life took on a rhythm that felt both familiar and newly bright. My team showed up early, their footsteps soft on the polished concrete floors. Steam rose from the industrial irons in thin white ribbons. The scent of fresh-cut fabric drifted through the air. Instead of the old weight I often carried home with me, I felt grounded, like my work finally lived on solid earth. There were small moments of unexpected tenderness, too. Maya, my closest friend since college, left her corporate job and joined us full-time. On her first day, she walked into the studio holding 2 coffees, the minty winter air still clinging to her coat, and she hugged me in a way that said she understood the journey even without the details. One of my seamstresses brought in a loaf of warm bread her grandmother had taught her to make, leaving it on my desk with a handwritten note, "For everything you keep building." These were the kinds of gestures that had been absent in my family, but abundant among the people who had become my chosen circle. Rebuilding wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, like the sound of a sewing machine humming through an early morning. I found myself lingering at the studio longer, not because I was overwhelmed, but because the space felt like home. My new apartment slowly transformed alongside it, fresh paint drying against the walls, the faint scent of pine from the newly sanded floors, wide windows letting in the long stretch of late afternoon light. Every evening, I opened the windows to let in the cool air, watching the curtains billow softly like steady breaths. The real change, though, wasn't external. It was in the way I saw myself when I caught my reflection in those new windows. I didn't see the girl my mother had looked past. I saw a woman who had built something with her own hands, something no one else could take credit for or diminish because they hadn't imagined it first. The Vogue cover launched a wave of interviews and speaking engagements, but even when the excitement settled, my sense of self didn't waver. I'd thought the validation might fade quickly once the headlines moved on. Instead, it took on a quieter form, becoming part of the foundation under me rather than the wind at my back. On a cool spring evening, Weeks after the confrontation, I stepped out onto the small balcony of my new place. Below, the street hummed with distant traffic. A neighbor watered her potted plants, the soft splash of water hitting soil, drifting upward. The sky above Brooklyn glowed faintly with city light. I leaned against the railing, the metal warm under my palms even in the fading day, and realized I no longer felt that old urge to prove myself. Not to anyone, especially not to her. Healing had come in small steps, not declarations. It came quietly like a window opening after years of being painted shut. And I understood now that the loudest part of the story, the confrontation, wasn't the ending. It was the beginning of breathing differently. I took a slow breath, letting it settle deep in my chest. The city exhaled with me, a soft hum below my feet. In that moment, the journey made sense in a way it never had before. Every dismissal, every underestimation, every small wound had led to this quiet place where I finally stood steady in who I was. And as the evening breeze brushed against my face, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere blocks away, a simple truth rose up inside me, calm and certain. Some people won't see your worth until the world reflects it back at them. But the worth was always yours long before they learned how to look.